Hello Year 8 and welcome to the next presentation about the 19th century, and this one is about political reform and why there was political reform. Now the first slide we're going to look at is a contemporary British cartoon depicting the French Revolution. Contemporary, as you know, in this context means it was produced at the time, so sometime between 1789 and 1793. And here the French Revolution is portrayed as a monster consisting of the guillotine, the method of execution used, together with a French revolutionary on the top wearing a hat symbolising that, and he's saying, I'm coming, I shall have you though I am at your heels now, I'll be at your head presently. And you have members of the British upper classes, the British establishment running away, you have a judge running away, a landowner running away, and the implication is that the same problems France has had, a revolution is going to happen in Great Britain. Now this caused the British political establishment to react by banning meetings, political meetings. Things called the Combination Acts were passed as well, banning trade unions. But in 1819, 4 years after the Battle of Waterloo, there was a gathering in Manchester at St Peter's Fields to hear a famous speaker called Orator Hunt, who was calling for a greater political freedom and for greater democracy. And it was broken up by the local militia, the local TA. I think they were a bit drunk at the time, and they waded in with swords, cutlasses drawn, and 11 were killed and 400 were injured. And it was ironically called the Peterloo Massacre because it's a play on Waterloo, and the event, the massacre took place in St Peter's Fields in Manchester. But it was a real turning point, and from this point onwards the protests continued. There was also a realisation on the part of the British political establishment they couldn't react using this kind of force. There had to be some sort of dialogue. Now at this time there was democracy in Great Britain. The time I'm talking about, by the way, is 1831. But it wasn't full democracy. In fact, some areas of the country had no MPs at all because the boundaries for constituencies had been drawn back in the 15th century. So you had a lot of strange situations. For example, Manchester had no MPs. Birmingham had no MPs, despite being now a big bustling city, whereas tiny villages out in the countryside had MPs. So for example, Old Sarum in Wiltshire had 6 voters and 2 MPs. Clearly this is a situation that's completely wrong, and it led to corruption because it meant that voters could be bribed easily, and they were usually bribed with alcohol. So the Birmingham Political Union was set up by wealthy industrialists campaigning for political reform, and they had lots of money, and they were able to campaign very effectively as a result. Now, to cut quite a long and complicated story short, in 1832 a Reform Act was passed, and this Reform Act gave more people the vote and extended constituencies to places like Birmingham and Manchester. But it didn't give the vote, and the word is enfranchise. It didn't enfranchise all of the working class. In fact, I think it was now between about 5 and 10% more people had the vote. But it did now mean that the middle classes in these cities had the vote. And here you have a contemporary cartoon cutting down the rotten boroughs. Rotten boroughs were those places like Old Sarum in Wiltshire, where there were very few voters, and as a result there was corruption, and they were called rotten boroughs. So here this tree is being chopped down by the reformers. Now, organisations like the Birmingham Political Union had been supported by the working classes, but the working classes, many of them felt furious they didn't get their vote as well, and so a new group emerged called the Charsists, and they had a chart which I'll talk about in a moment with 6 basic aims on it, And their leader was a man called Fergus O'Connor, who was an Irish barrister. And you can see there's a reference to Chartist riots in Newport. Well, that's actually Newport, Wales, not Newport, Shropshire. And there was always the threat of them using physical force. They rarely did so, though. In fact, normally they confined themselves to writing long petitions, such as the one you see there being pushed into Parliament, signed by millions of people calling for vote. And their last major meeting was at Kennington Common in London. You can see the photograph there in 1848. And nothing came of it. It was a flop, even though thousands and thousands turned up. So the Chartists, in the short term, they didn't achieve their aims, but in the long term, 5 out of the 6 aims were achieved, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Now, the Chartists called themselves the Chartists because it's an inheritance really of the Magna Carta, which you would have studied in year 7. And they had 6 points. I'm just going to read through those now. They wanted votes for all men. That was finally achieved in 1918, but also, of course, votes for women were also brought in at that point as well. They wanted equal electoral districts, which now we have there is roughly 100,000 voters in each electoral district. Payments of MPs, that was brought in finally in 1911. Before that, MPs weren't paid, so therefore MPs tended to be from the wealthy landowning classes. They wanted annual general elections. That's never happened. Elections are every 4 years roughly. And they wanted the secret vote or the secret ballot. Before, you used to stand behind the candidate you wanted to vote for. Now clearly again you could be intimidated or bribed. With the secret ballot that can't happen. And the secret vote, the secret ballot, when you put your vote in a ballot box, came in 1872.